everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program at the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Megan Cassidy. I'm the crime reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, and I will be moderating today's program. We'd like to thank our members, donors, and supporters for making this and all other programs possible. We are grateful for their support and hope that others will follow their example to support the club during these uncertain times. Today, I am joined by Jennifer Carlson, an associate professor of sociology and government and public policy at the University of Arizona. Jennifer is the author of a recent book called Policing the Second Amendment, which details the relationship between guns, the police, and race in the United States. Jennifer's work is supplemented by her background in criminal justice and race and ethnicity to generate a well-rounded view of police perspectives on race and gun accessibility. Jennifer's research on this topic comes at a crucial moment in America, where many of us are re-examining the implications of race and policing in our society. By exploring local and national newspapers, interviewing 6 police chiefs, and surveying gun licensing processes, Policing the Second Amendment presents an inside view of how police view guns and gun violence. These conversations are often intertwined with race, as people of color face a system of gun criminalization often viewed as biased and unfair. We'll be discussing a lot in the next hour, and I want to ask your questions too. If you're watching along with us, please put your questions in the text chat on YouTube or the comments on Facebook, and we will be getting to them later in the program. So, Jennifer, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So I just finished your book. It is excellent. It's super interesting, especially for me, especially. I'm dealing with these kind of stories all the time, and I think that your book touches on a lot of issues that aren't commonly discussed in mainstream media. Your book starts off with the story that probably a lot of the audience remembers, that in 2016, a black man named Philando Castile, he was a concealed pistol license holder, got pulled over by police, and he was fatally shot while he was reaching for his driver's license. This incident, as you put it, put both the left and the right in uncomfortable sides of the gun debate. Was it this incident in particular that inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, the book starts out with this case because it is so powerfully sort of illustrative of the intersections of guns, gun politics, law enforcement, and race. And so Philando Castile, as you mentioned, a school cafeteria supervisor, a father, fiance, an African-American man. He's pulled over because he fits the description, and he is killed by the officer that pulls him over. And so I found it fascinating in the midst of this tragedy, this killing, that actually for a very short moment, or I shouldn't say moment, because it actually happened also after the cop's acquittal happened. There were points where sort of the two sides of the debate almost seemed to have this unlikely consensus on what happened. From the New York Times to the National Review, you had people saying something went wrong here. Whatever you think about guns, whatever you think about the police, this should not have happened, from the actual incident up to the acquittal. And of course, though, nothing changed as a result of that. Perhaps we could have had a better gun debate, but we didn't. NRA members called on the NRA to make a statement about this case in favor of sort of protecting the right of people in the U.S. to own and carry guns. The NRA didn't do that. The NRA instead used very euphemistic language, saying, something along the lines of events in Minnesota are troubling. Meanwhile, very explicitly supporting police and police victims of violence that happened also that week. So this became sort of this really powerful public example of sort of how the politics of the police and the politics of guns intersect. But my questions about sort of how race shapes what it means to be a good guy with a gun versus a bad guy with a gun, how, what are the terms, what are the stakes of exercising the right to keep and bear arms that is laid out in the Second Amendment, how that's inflected with race. That actually started as part of my research for my first book, Citizen Protectors. And so what I found in that book was not just that gun carriers had very different ideas about the police and sort of whether the police, their sort of how their guns put them in relation to police, depending on their own sort of racial identities. But they also described to me really different treatment by the police. Whites very rarely experiencing harassment or discrimination or that sort of thing by virtue of their decision to exercise their right to keep and bear arms, whereas African-American interviewees and people I met as part of my observations in that book kept sort of bringing up these incidents of harassment and discrimination. And so that sort of opened my mind to thinking through what is actually going on in the context of gun law enforcement. And I actually had a very sort of up close and personal experience with this. As part of that book, I was an ethnographer, which meant that I engaged in a lot of the practices and sort of stuff that, the people I was studying were involved in. And so I would go to open carry picnics. I would participate, in different gun related stuff. And so there's one incident where I was with a group of open carriers who were actually stopped by the police, and the police ran all of our firearms. I was carrying a firearm at the time, and I can talk about the politics of all of that. And so, this is Michigan, where you're supposed to have your gun registered. My gun was registered. And the officer came back to me and said that I was actually carrying an unregistered gun. Now, as a PhD student at UC Berkeley, of course, I was immediately horrified. I thought, oh my God, this is the end of my everything. So I went to my car, I pulled out my registration, which I was not legally required to carry, but nevertheless produced it. And the officer gave me back my gun and said, I would have given this back to you anyway, because essentially these mistakes happen all the time. And so what happened was a bureaucratic error. And so that really opened my mind both to sort of the ways in which bureaucratic process opens up the sort of door for different kinds of gun criminalization, but also how officer discretion is so crucial in terms of who is actually held accountable for these, for these infractions. And so, as a white woman who appears, I was about 10 years younger then, I couldn't help but wonder how my own sort of presentation of self, my identity impacted how that police officer treated me. And so that's what I wanted to know. I wanted to know how race enters into not just the politics of guns, but also gun law enforcement, which is a question we generally don't ask in terms of the gun debate. We talk about the gun policies that we want or don't want, but we don't look at the level of enforcement. So that's that's kind of how I got inspired to get into the texture of this book.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating topic. And one thing that I really liked is that you argue that there are more useful ways to frame gun debates than using the usual terms like gun control and gun rights. So instead, you said that the public should think about the debates in the terms of gun popularism and gun militarism. And these are sometimes overlapping theories. Can you kind of explain what each of them mean and how they can intersect with one another?
For sure. Yeah. So one of the things that has sort of troubled me and frustrated me often in conversations about gun politics, gun laws, is this line that we often hear in the United States, which is that we don't have gun control. And most certainly when we compare the United States and the apparatus of gun regulations to Canada, to the UK, to Australia, to New Zealand now, we don't have gun restrictions and regulations like those countries do. We don't have an all-out ban, for example, on assault-style weapons. But what we do have is a very American style of gun control, or at least that's what I would argue, that we have gun criminalization. We have a set of laws, not unlike drug laws, that use guns as sort of a vehicle of criminalization, often resulting in major racial disparities in terms of enforcement. And so sort of coming at that insight and sort of trying to make sense of how we could reconstruct the gun debate from that starting point, that actually we do have gun regulations, but they're not the kinds of gun regulations that we might imagine when we think through the common terms of the gun debate, led me to think through these kind of two axes along which police, but actually also the general public and both sides of the debate sort of talk through gun laws and politics and policies. And so gun militarism, I think, is the easier one to kind of wrap your head around, because in some ways it reflects sort of what we have had a now somewhat sustained conversation, at least since for the last 5 years or so in the public domain, about police militarization and sort of this presumed authoritarian or authoritative sort of relationship between police and the people they police. So thinking about sort of gun militarism with an emphasis on disarming, aggressively sort of waging a war on guns, adopting and embracing tough on crime gun policies like mandatory minimums and laws that increase sentencing guidelines. For example, if a crime is committed in the presence of a gun, even if that crime has absolutely nothing to do or even involves that gun, the gun is merely there. There are laws on the books, such as the Use a Gun in Your Done law in California, that actually increase the amount of time served for that crime. And so, this is kind of motivated by this very racialized imaginary of who is a bad guy with a gun. Gangbangers, drug dealers, that's those sort of racist tropes of urban criminality that stipulate boys and men of color as criminal. That's kind of embedded in the gun militarism framework. And so we see this, in some ways on both sides of the debate. We see this in the calls from the NRA to, enforce law and order, enforce the laws on the books. And we also hear it from, the kind of consensus of sort of on both sides for, aggressively going after the quote unquote real gun criminals. And so anytime you hear those lines of sort of drawing lines between the bad guy versus the good guy with a gun and that sort of thing, that this kind of ideology is very likely at work. Gun populism is very different, though. Gun populism is what we hear when we hear police, for example, celebrating first responders, private civilians as first responders, police who see gun carriers as potentially, as proactive and pro-social elements of social order. And so in contrast to sort of the tropes and typecasts that I heard with regard to gun militarism, with gun populism, it's it's kind of the salt of the earth types that are sort of aligned with middle class middle class respectability and that sort of thing. So the teacher, the rancher with a gun, the normal people, the people who live at 22 Cottage Lane and that sort of thing. And so, if you view sort of the gun debate from these ideologies or these kinds of ways of talking about guns, I call them different dueling gun talks in the book, you actually see that the gun debate is, first of all, it doesn't line up quite in the same way, and you see sort of the same sort of racial ways of thinking through who's a good guy and who's a bad guy with a gun in various somewhat surprising corners of the gun debate.
Okay. And in your book, you talk about all of the links between gun politics and police politics, and it's something I guess I'd never really effectively connected so directly as you did. But can you kind of walk briefly through the history of this with the NRA's role in courting the police and getting each other on the same side?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful for the audience to vet some statistics just on public opinion or opinion among the police, which is that police, even though we can imagine, a kind of argument for why police might prefer fewer guns in circulation, based on the public opinion data or the police opinion data that's available, police not only support gun rights over gun control, but they do so in far greater numbers than the general public. And so this is actually, sort of a century-long, a development century-long in the making with regard to how police have become sort of aligned with gun politics. And one of the really fascinating, maybe the most surprising things that I learned as part of my research for the book was how much the National Rifle Association has worked to cultivate ties with police and police unions and police organizations. So as early as 1916, the National Rifle Association actually called for police to qualify with their firearms, to get regular standardized training. And so we talk about this, this idea of police qualification on firearms all the time. And that's an idea that actually, over 100 years ago, the NRA really pushed. The NRA, advocated advocated for police to be armed in a standard way. So a lot of people may not realize that not only are the police a relatively young institution in that they didn't exist really in the United States before the 1850s, but this idea that police would have standard issued weaponry, that is also rather new and didn't really come into fruition until the early part of the 20th century. And so throughout the 20th century, you actually see the NRA sort of working with cultivating ties with police, creating competitions, training opportunities. Right now, if you look at what the NRA does to cultivate ties with the police, there are scholarships, awards, there's grants actually that the NRA gives to individual police departments for weapons and training support. There's print media that's directed at law enforcement. And so there's a great deal that the NRA has done to actually cultivate the police as allies in the gun debate.
And you talked about how there is kind of this divide among police chiefs. I know you said that a lot of police officers more so support this gun populism theory or arming everybody. But I guess, can you explain like why the latter has become so much more dominant? I mean, I guess I would think that more police would in effect want more guns off the street. Is there just this implicit trust in police and the people? Because that seems surprising to me.
Yeah. So I think what I really try to do in the book is sort of emphasize that what police think about guns and how they understand guns and gun policy, it's rooted in a lot of different things. It's rooted in their firsthand experiences of gun violence, what kind of gun violence that they experience in their communities, the kinds of news and bulletins that they receive as part of being police chiefs. But it's also based on sort of these broader ideologies of crime in the United States. And so when we think about gun violence and sort of what are the big when you say those words, what are the images that pop into your mind? There's kind of, I realized as I was interviewing police, there's a pretty big divide in terms of where their minds go in terms of when you say the words gun violence. So is it sort of urban crime, gang violence, drug-related violence, and that sort of set of things, or is it mass shootings? Is it mass shootings happening in suburban and rural areas, in schools, and that sort of thing? And so it isn't the case that police either were kind of adherents to gun militarism versus gun populism, but that their ways of thinking about what's an appropriate way of dealing with gun violence differed based on sort of the kind of gun violence that they were imagining as problematic and front and center to them. And so even as I was interviewing them, they kind of slipped between these two different ways of thinking about gun violence. And so in terms of so I just want to make it clear that I don't think police want everybody to be armed. They certainly are in favor of some sort of background check or vetting system. I think that was definitely something that came up over and over. But still, this idea, I think what's really profound is this idea that at least some segment of the population is not to have them armed is not problematic to the police. So where does that come from? Why does that happen? And how is that something new? So obviously I didn't do longitudinal interviews. I wish I could. But from my conversations with police, what it seems like has been a key turning point has been the emergence of sort of the era of mass shootings. So I interviewed one chief who was actually in Colorado. He wasn't a responding officer, but he was in Colorado when the Columbine massacre happened in 1999. And for him, it was devastating to hear him talk about how, he felt like that law enforcement as a community felt that they failed those kids because of the way that they followed protocols with regard to basically contain and wait strategies. So contain the area, wait for SWAT to arrive. After Columbine, there was a massive shift in police strategies for responding to mass shootings. And instead, it was a much more first responder type approach. So what happens is that police, what seems to have happened is that police have really embraced this sort of emphasis on first responders and broaden the category of who can be a first responder. So, I had one chief who told me it doesn't matter if it's a police officer officer, if it's an armed private civilian, if I need help, I want someone armed who can help me. And so I think this idea of sort of gun violence in the form of mass shootings that can happen, one of the chiefs said, in the strangest of places. Of course, these aren't necessarily strange places, but for sort of the class and the class and racialized nature of the white picket fence and the suburb and that sort of thing. That these shootings can happen in the strangest of places, and so to not have a firearm, and so this is also why police told me that they carried off duty. They were very few said they carried off duty because they were concerned about harms coming their way as a result of something they did as a police officer, as a result of their profession. They said that their off-duty carry guns were about making sure that if there was a mass shooting, that they would be able to respond because they would be devastated, ashamed, embarrassed, all of this very evocative language, if they were in that situation and could not be armed. And I just want to point out that is so different from how they talk about sort of responding to violence in the context of urban gun violence, which, it very much elicits this sort of warrior mentality that we discuss a lot in sort of public discourse about police militarism. This sort of brand of policing was very different and elicited a very different set of emotions. And so I think that it's really mass shootings that has shifted, at least in terms of how police sort of explain not just their thoughts on concealed carriers and gun carriers, but even their relationship with their own guns. They cite, some of them very explicitly, that the turning point was one or another mass shooting that has happened in the last 10 or 20 years.
Wow. Okay. So I know that you interviewed police chiefs in California, in Arizona, in Michigan. Since we're in California, I'd like to talk more in depth about them. You described that many of the police chiefs here describe this kind of anti-elitism mentality. Can you describe what this means and how this sentiment differed from the chiefs in Arizona and Michigan?
Yeah, so the California context is really interesting. It is interesting because unlike in Michigan and Arizona, it's, depending on where you are, relatively difficult to get a license to concealed carry, and you generally cannot open carry in California. So the stakes of sort of what gun rights meant in a practical sense were different in California than in Arizona or Michigan, where gun carry was really front and center. So that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind in terms of thinking about chiefs' attitudes on guns in California. So what I found in California was, and this is not actually, I think, unique to guns. I think in some ways the gun issue is a way to express sort of sentiment, suspicions, legal cynicism, and apprehensions about the legislative process and the lawmaking process in California. So, everything from, lawsuit capital of the world is California to, complaints about the sort of complicated nature of the criminal code in California. One of the things that came up that was really fascinating to me was not just how police sort of saw this intricate sort of web of gun laws as making it very easy to commit a gun crime, or really any, a variety of misdemeanors or crimes. One of actually the chiefs in Arizona who used to work in California, he was like, yeah, the joke in California is drive 2 miles and you've just committed a crime. And that's, just to kind of, get at this idea that the criminal code is so complicated and it's so sort of such a web. And so, police chiefs were definitely concerned about that in terms of enforcement. It created an enforcement dilemma for them because it's very difficult to keep up with complicated law, not just in terms of how it's changing, but also how it's actually how it should be implemented so that when it's kicked up to the courts, if it does get kicked up to the courts are aligned with what the police are doing, what they expect the courts to, to see as legal, constitutional, and what have you. So that creates sort of an enforcement dilemma for police. There's also this other element that I found absolutely fascinating, which is that it wasn't just that police were concerned about enforcing the law, but that they were concerned with how these laws would come back on them. So there were complaints about sort of, legislators who would write laws and either not consult the police or not think through how these laws might affect police's capacity to access ammo, magazines, firearms or affect how police, affect how police actually engage in their jobs. Also, there was a personal stake in this too. So people may not realize that a lot of the gun laws in California are there are exceptions for police, and this makes sense, of course, if there's some kind of professional obligation that requires that to be such. With regard to the assault weapons ban in California, police are active duty police can purchase and own assault weapons, provided that they're duty guns to some extent. What happens though is that police departments may not have the funds, for example, to purchase these guns. So police will use their personal funds to purchase these guns. And once they retire, they are required to relinquish those firearms somehow, either by just turning them in or getting reimbursed. A lot of agencies may not be able to necessarily reimburse. And so it actually creates this sort of incentive, or I shouldn't say incentive, it creates this sort of catch 22, where police actually end up coming out of this much more cynical about gun laws and sort of, how gun laws affect them than they may otherwise do. So there's the irony that the very set of laws that are kind of, put, for example, California on the map as a, gun restrictive place are actually in some ways cultivating pro-gun sentiment among police by virtue of the way that the law is written.
Right. And some of the, or a lot of the retired California cops are moving to Arizona, from what you said.
Yeah, well, that was actually something really fascinating, is that I kept finding myself interviewing who were former California cops who were now police chiefs in Arizona. Yeah.
That's funny, yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, you got a really rare peek inside gun boards in Michigan, I believe it was. Where largely current or former law enforcement officers would decide whether to issue or deny or revoke gun licenses. Can you talk about what you learned by watching these?
Yeah, this was just an eye-popping part of my research. So these gun boards are basically places where people who apply for or have a license to carry concealed are called to the gun board if either something is flagged on their applications for that gun license, or somehow they're flagged for having done something to raise the concerns of the gun board. And so this can be everything from a sodomy arrest from the 1950s, an unpaid parking ticket from 5 years ago. It can be a current arrest. It can be simply a police referral that the police maybe didn't make an arrest, but nevertheless referred someone to gun board for review. So really sort of a broad net of things that can bring someone to a gun board. And the surprise, so already we know, in terms of the criminal justice system and who's most likely to have contact with the criminal justice system, we know that there's a racial disparity there. Right. In terms of who populates criminal justice records. Actually, whites are more likely to have contact with police because they're more likely to call the police to initiate that conversation, or that contact. But when it comes to criminal records and having a criminal record, having a felony record, people of color are vastly overrepresented. And so, and this is not just people who, by the way, are convicted of a crime, but people who simply have police contact, right? And so I want to make it really clear that this is not an indication of criminality. This is an indication of interaction with the criminal justice system, which is, a totally different topic that we could spend a lot of time talking about. And so what I saw on these gun boards was really a perversion of what I think a lot of people think gun licensing is. So, we have this sort of line that it's concealed carry outside of places like California and New York, places like Arizona, if you apply for a license here, or Michigan, places with what's called shall issue legislation, that it's non-discretionary, and basically if you fulfill the criteria, you get the license. And it's a straightforward process, and it's seen as a good thing for gun rights, right? It's an expansion of gun rights. And what I found was that there is a lot of discretion in terms of how what seem to be clear-cut bureaucratic sort of statutory requirements are actually used in ways to not necessarily deny people a gun license, but to create the concealed carry licensing process as a way to discipline people about proper public or private behavior. And so what I found in these licensing boards was that African American and white claimants who are called to these boards were treated very, very differently. They came for different reasons. African Americans were much more likely to have old criminal records be the reason, older than a certain number of years be the reason that they're called to the board. But even among comparable cases, for example, someone called for domestic violence, someone called for not disclosing concealed pistol licensing status to a police officer, which you're required to do if you're stopped in Michigan. African American claimants would be lectured on how to interact with the police. They would be told, basically, you need to, in so many words, you need to understand that you're going to look like a threat with a gun to a police officer, and you need to put that officer at ease. White claimants were not given that same lesson, we could call it. Same with domestic violence. I saw African American claimants, and I say take the stand. They stood at a podium, even though it was not actually a trial, it was an administrative process. They had their partners called for questioning at the podium as well. Whites did not experience this level of scrutiny. And so it was this really kind of powerful forum to see, we can think about sort of how race and racial, things operate at very, very different levels. And so what I saw was that the gun itself, the gun license itself, was actually being used as a tool. In the book, I talk about it in terms of racial disciplining and a way to sort of discipline, particularly men of color, in terms of the appropriate behaviors that are the conditions of their gun licenses.
And so you and I were talking earlier about some of the more recent issues that could affect gun ownership, gun violence in the U.S. You said that you had spoken to a lot of gun sellers during the pandemic, and they've experienced a huge surge. Can you kind of talk about what the pandemic has been like for them and kind of the reasons behind the spikes in gun sales?
Yeah, this has been really fascinating to talk to gun sellers. So I talked to over 50 gun sellers in Michigan, California, Arizona, and Florida to try and get a handle of what they're experiencing with this massive surge. And it's unprecedented in terms of the number of guns that are being sold. And of course, we use the NICS background check system as a proxy for the number of guns sold, but the number of background checks that have been happening on a monthly basis have just kind of blown previous records out of the water. And so, it's a big question to sort of unravel. It seems like there's at least 3 different distinct surges in terms of gun purchasing. One sort of in response to coronavirus and the sense of sort of social insecurity that sort of elicits, seeing toilet paper out at the supermarket, not knowing what this pandemic is or what is sort of the consequences of how governments will respond, what are the what is are we going to have lockdowns, how prolonged are they going to be, how protracted is this all going to be as we try and figure out what's going on. Then in June, with the murder of George Floyd, there seemed to be another wave of people who were purchasing because of very specific fears about civil unrest amid the protests and all of that. And now it seems like there's, kind of underlying all of this, but becoming a bit louder, is concerns about the election, both in terms of, and we saw this last night in terms of the debate, the sort of growing sense that there's going to be violence related to the election, either running up to it or in the aftermath of it, as well as sort of the usual election concerns that that someone who is someone who is not favorable to gun rights could be elected and pass laws, and so you should get it while you can. But yeah, it's been really interesting because unlike the gun carriers that I interviewed in 2010, there seems to be a much stronger consensus about the possibility of violence. And that's not to say that gun sellers are endorsing this or celebrating this. Many of them are kind of scratching their heads and saying this is not the time to move from the ballot box to the box of ammo. But this kind of sense that a lot of people are believing that it's inevitable, even if it isn't necessarily inevitable, is definitely something that has been striking in terms of these interviews.
Right. Um, just kind of in general, what types of policies do you believe that police departments should adopt to curb a racial viewpoint of gun violence?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And I think that there is a lot of, yeah, wow, that's a very, that's a very hard question to answer. And the reason that it's so hard is that a lot of the, one of the go-to kind of ways of, especially under President Obama, of sort of dealing with racial disparities in police violence, the killing of people of color, particularly African Americans and Native peoples, has been to sort of introduce these implicit bias trainings. So this idea that you get people to sort of reflect and think about their implicit biases, recognize implicit bias, and they will react differently with regard to encounters that they may have in the course of policing. The problem, though, is that there is not a lot of evidence that that actually works. There's even evidence that implicit bias training can deepen stereotypes. And
Really?
so this is, yeah, so I think that, so there's that. Then there's, sort of the calls for creating a new, paradigm of policing, or not necessarily creating, but sort of supporting the prevalence of a new kind of policing, such as guardian policing. So replace the warrior with the guardian. And my apprehension with that is that we've kind of already done this. We did this in the 1990s in the aftermath of the brutal beating of Rodney King. Part of the Clinton crime bill that included the assault weapons ban at the federal level also included a whole lot of money to public law enforcement in the hopes that they would expand community policing as part of what they do. And so community policing has long been sort of this celebrated way of kind of squaring the circle with regard to police community relations, racism in policing, racial disparities in policing outcomes, and all of this. And that a lot of that money actually ended up moving toward supporting police militarization. So, whether training, military equipment, or what have you. And so I think that I think that to say that, adopting policies, it's really hard to think through just because we have so many examples of policy failure. I think that recruitment is a huge piece of the puzzle. I think that thinking about what we as the public ask police to do is a huge piece of the puzzle. And I think thinking through sort of, this is not just the stuff that we're seeing with public law enforcement that has been, kind of capturing headlines in the news and, over the last several years. This is not new. This is not, it's not new, not just in the sense of literally the Kerner Commission, the Kerner report was commenting on such similar dynamics in the 1960s. And even that is not new. We can look back to what happened under Prohibition. We can look back to, all the way to really early forms of policing before public law enforcement, when you essentially had whites deputized to stop any person who appeared to be of African descent and detain them, abuse them, physically harass them, physically assault them violently. And that was sort of baked into sort of the sort of joint production of a racial caste system in the US and putative social public order. And so I think that and so obviously that gets all sort of accelerated once we get to the 1960s. We have the war on crime. We have a whole host of strategies, protocols, government initiatives, but also private actions, whether we're thinking about, media, obviously, journalists and news reporting, but also, the popularization of cop shows, the popularization of sort of cop dramas. And so I think, there's this policing scholar named Egon Bittner who makes this point. He's writing in the 1970s, and I think it says something that at this point is still so relevant. He says there's something perverse about how the public relates to the police. The public wants the police to basically deal with problems that they don't want to deal with, and I think a lot of that is the white public who is asking police to quote unquote solve problems that they're not going to solve directly themselves, and they blame the police when they either respond with too much force or too little force, but they refuse to actually sort of see their own investment in police and what police do. And I think that it's not a policy that just police departments can implement. It's a shift in how we think through what policing is in this society and how much it matters to our sense, our basic sense of sort of what it means to feel safe. And so that's where this kind of connection, I mean, the big part of the book is connecting gun politics with the politics of the police and making this argument that you cannot talk about these things separately because they both come from the same impulse of sort of this sense of how to create both social order, but also a feeling of social order. And in American society, generally, people in the U.S. turn to the police and they turn to privately owned firearms to pursue those ends.
So based on your research, what do you think is the future of firearm ownership? Which direction is it going? Are we becoming a more armed society, or do you think that the pendulum is swinging the other direction?
Yeah, I most certainly think that, certainly the numbers of new gun owners as a result of this huge, the surge in purchasing over the past 6 months definitely suggests that we are not having fewer guns in circulation. There's somewhere, we don't, again, know the number of guns in circulation because we don't have a national registry, but somewhere between 300 and 400 million guns are in circulation in the US. Wow. And guns are durable objects. They don't degrade. They last a long, long time. And so I would say that in terms of, are we becoming less armed? I think what we're seeing is, and this is kind of the story with politics in general, that we are becoming more divided in terms of our gun politics. And so, one way to illustrate that is, the people who own guns, people are owning more guns, even the people who own guns. So there's these, the phenomenon of super owners. There also is this sort of, people have talked about it as the politicization of everything. I find it fascinating that where you go to get groceries or where you go to get a cup of coffee is now infused with gun politics. So there are pro-gun coffee shops. There are coffee shops, Starbucks was made a couple years back, basically made a statement that they're not going to allow guns in their stores. That was sort of a moment of sort of before they were kind of embraced by the gun rights community. And at that point, they were obviously not embraced. And so it's not just sort of, whether we own guns or not, it's how gun politics are actually being refracted into all these different spaces, not just other political issues, which we see that, in terms of these different issues being connected that maybe weren't as tightly connected before, but also in terms of just like what we do as just as people beyond sort of the politics. Now we can't escape the politics. And so this is why, I obviously write, I research, I also teach. And, this is why, to plug the university, I find it so crucial to be able to talk to students at the University of Arizona, undergrads who actually have a wide array of views on guns, which I love. I love having a class that has many different viewpoints and actually getting them to talk to each other and have a conversation where they can actually talk to each other and recognize and hold space for one another's views. And I think that's where I see sort of this deepening in terms of gun politics. Not that we're going to become more and more divided.
Yeah. And so, how many years did you say that you researched for this book?
I started interviewing in 2014. So I did my interviews in 2014 to 2017.
Okay. So did you, I know you're dealing with so many serious topics, but was there any, I guess, favorite part of the research, anything that just surprised you so much?
I mean, I was grateful for police being willing to talk to me and for being really candid about, especially in California, I think that there's a lot of political pressure all over the place, particularly in California. And I really appreciated the willingness of police to talk to me, the willingness of police to be really frank about their thoughts and experiences with guns, gun politics, gun violence. I could not have done this book without them. So yeah, I mean, I think there's this is why I love qualitative work, and I'm sure as a reporter you also experience this as well. I feel really lucky that I get to talk to people across the political spectrum, and get to sort of see things through their eyes, to try and make sense of yeah, this crazy world we're in. It's a privilege to do that.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like with your work, you were able to get a lot of really unvarnished points of view that somebody like me can't get, because I get the political statements all the time. But from the interviews I've seen, it looks like the police chiefs were very candid with you.
Yeah. So I think that there were a few things going on. I actually started this research when I was at the University of Toronto. I have U.S. citizenship. I'm not Canadian, but I started my academic career at the University of Toronto. And there's different politics with kind of getting research approved at different universities. And so for whatever reason, the University of Toronto was very adamant that I go out of my way to sort of protect the anonymity of police and ensure that there's nothing that could trace them back to having participated in this research. Mm-hmm. So, not recording, but also not taking signatures. So there's literally, it's a very, it was a process that really protected the confidentiality and anonymity of the interviewees. And so I think that was, I think that actually University of Toronto did me a huge favor, because I know that a lot of police chiefs would have kind of questioned whether they wanted to be a part of a research project if they were going to be recorded or that sort of thing.
Right.
And so yeah, I think that was really powerful. But I also think that I think that sometimes the issue with getting people to be honest and getting people to sort of be frank and really get into the sort of the way they think about these issues, a lot of it just has to do with sort of not just asking the right questions, but asking the questions that they've been kind of, mulling over, but that no one's asked them. And so I think that for some of them, at least, it was an opportunity to talk about something that they actually don't have a chance to talk about in a sort of extended way beyond the sound bites that they're expected to provide to the news and to the public and that sort of thing. So I was super grateful that they were willing to take me up on that.
Right. Do you have, I know you're just finishing this up, but do you have any, the next project in mind where you're going to focus on?
Yeah. So I'm actually starting to think through what a book about 2020 will look like with these new interviews with gun sellers. Of course, that's really difficult because the story of 2020 has not been written yet. And so, it's been helpful to sort of think through political dynamics that I think many of us, if not all of us, are kind of just at a loss for. But I think that it's been also helpful to have that space to do that, or to focus on that. But yeah, that's the next project is thinking about gun sales, gun politics, gun markets at the edge of democracy.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're about 20 minutes left right now, so I'm going to switch over to some of the audience questions. Let's see, let me go up. We have quite a few. Let's see. All right. The first question is, would stripping police of their handguns help? And if so, how?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. It's super fascinating because there's actually a criminologist at UC Berkeley named Frank Zimring who's written about police perpetrated killings, and his argument is actually gun control is the answer. That there's a simple answer. There's a simple answer for why other countries don't face this same elevated rate of police perpetrated homicides, and so reducing the number of guns in circulation will de-escalate the sort of terms of even stopping someone in the first place with regard to police encounters. The flip side of that, though, of course, is exactly what this question sort of elicits, is this question of, well, why not disarm the police? And it's funny because one of the examples that is sometimes touted with that is the English example, the UK, although they do have armed police. And in some ways, I think that they have really, that's something that they benefit from in terms of that image, in terms of police legitimacy, but they still, they're not a disarmed force, right? So as far as what would that do? Well, I think the first thing, so this is like one of the things you figure out when you're interviewing people. The first few interviews, you ask questions and you realize that your questions are maybe not the best questions to build rapport. And so one of my questions was, what would you feel as a police officer if you couldn't have a gun on duty? And I mean, it was just utter disdain. I wouldn't even have this job. How could you even ask that question? I mean, it exposed me as, what kind of imagination do you have that you could imagine a world where police would not have guns, right? So I think that, I actually think that to question the relationship between the police officer and their duty handgun is to question police altogether. And so I think I guess that's how I'd answer that question, is that question is actually not asking about, removing handguns from police, but actually fundamentally rethinking who the police are, what they do, and why we turn to them, 911 callers as a society and what have you. And I guess what I would say is that if we did, so this gets back to, obviously all the debates about, police defunding, police transformation, reform, and what have you. And one of the things that I think we need to really grapple with is what exactly, and this is going to be different for people positioned differently at, in different spaces in different communities, but what exactly we want from the police as a state institution. What is it that we want from police? And what is it that police can provide that no other private or public institution can do? And until we come up with that answer, I don't think we have a good sense of how we can transform police, because all we're doing at that point is sort of, kind of putting a Band-Aid on something that maybe we've collectively decided we don't like a particular outcome, but we haven't yet figured out what it is we actually want. And for such a massive institution to, in so many ways, to have so much power and so much impact on our lives, particularly people who are, in over-policed areas, that's a question that is actually, it's somewhat crazy that we don't have a clear answer for that.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, how did military-style assault weapons end up in the hands of police? And is it due to the close relationship between police and the military?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stories, a lot of sort of vicissitudes in terms of how police get armed, right? And so one example that immediately comes to mind in terms of this question about is it police and the military is actually an example from the 1960s in the aftermath, as in the midst of the Detroit riot. And so one thing that we're so used to sort of talking about police militarization, we know about the 1033 program that basically offloads surplus military equipment to police departments. And, and that started in the 1990s. But prior to that, actually, if you go back to the 1960s, police were not actually able to get military surplus. In fact, because of basically egregious instances of, involving Southern police departments using military surplus equipment in their jurisdictions. Basically, the military stopped selling directly to police. So their surplus carbines, they were not selling to police. Now, the trick, though, is that the NRA still had an agreement with the military to sell discounted military surplus to its members. And so in Detroit in the 1960s, in the sort of immediate aftermath of the Detroit riot, the department could not afford to purchase carbines for its officers, but they could encourage their officers to join the NRA en masse in order to buy discounted carbines. So there's a lot of really interesting ways in which the sales of guns and gun markets intersect with policing and gun politics. As far as the introduction of the patrol rifle, usually the sort of conversation about that, or the explanation about that, the sort of shift from, or the shift toward having patrol rifles as sort of standard issue has to do with a Hollywood shootout in LA. And so that's sort of often treated as the sort of breaking point where police started in mass actually seeing patrol rifles as part of their arsenal of firearms. But yeah, the sort of history is really fascinating and complicated in terms of up to that point, how not just how armed police are or who is armed, but how they go about getting armed.
The next question is, with the exception of Senator Chris Murphy and Rep. Lucy McDuff, few national politicians seem to embrace gun reform and reducing gun violence as a pivotal issue. Why is that?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I think the typical answer, or the sort of answer that is often given to that question, is that you know, it's a losing battle with regard to the deep pockets of the NRA and the capacity of the NRA to galvanize its base. So, you know, when Clinton passed the series of gun reforms and gun control at the federal level in the early 90s, he lost control of Congress and sort of named the NRA as quote unquote the most powerful lobby in Washington. And so, you know, Al Gore's loss in his home state of Tennessee is attributed to the NRA, you know, being so powerfully able to galvanize its base. So I think that there's some of that. I think that there is some fatigue in terms of a debate that seems to be at a standstill. And I think that that's, again, why I think it's really important to think through how we can maybe think about this debate a little bit differently and have different ways of engaging with what's at stake. And then I think, I mean, I'm trying to think, it seems like the other piece is that, you know, just gun politics are very odd when we think about them as sort of, you know, local politics versus state politics versus at the federal level. At the state level, there is, you know, a whole lot of action that happens with regard to gun laws. If you look just at the year after Sandy Hook happened, I mean, just so much action in terms of gun laws, not just being proposed, but also passed. Gun laws in which there's actually surprisingly consensus on, for example, mental health related laws, which I think every time there is consensus, we should actually question that and think about what is the price of that consensus, because at least in my research for this book, a lot of that has been, you know, the criminalization of Blackness and sort of the use of guns as a vehicle of criminalization. But yeah, I think at the federal level, I think that too often guns sort of gets passed over in favor of other issues. And I've seen this happen, you know, even in terms of conversations, you know, about guns or debates about guns. I think that particularly in the last 4 years, there's been a tendency to, you know, like, for example, and I don't actually write about this in my book, but I could have a footnote in it, which is that when the killer of Philando Castile is acquitted, you know, that was when there was yet again, something else coming out about, you know, the relationship between Russia and, you know, the Trump campaign. And that conversation got so little time in terms of national debate. And it almost seemed like police shootings of people of color stopped when Trump was elected, if all you were doing was watching the news, because suddenly we didn't, and I guess the public discourse didn't have the bandwidth to also talk about that. Now, obviously that's erupted back into the sort of public discussion, but I think, I think that there is a way in which gun politics and also the politics of the police get sidelined at the federal level, and yeah. So, but I would say if you want to look for the action is happening at the state level.
Okay. Next question is, what did you discover, I guess if you research this, about the police enforcement of red flag laws?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because obviously California was one of the states in the aftermath of the mass shooting at UC Santa Barbara, was one of the states that sort of got the conversation rolling in terms of red flag laws. So I to be perfectly frank, police did not, that was not the focus sort of police concerns about gun policy and gun violence. That being said, though, I think that police had sort of a expectedly cynical attitude about even, we could also include personal protection orders, which also oftentimes include a gun ban on them. So different kinds of emergency orders. And so on the one hand, I think police were, they saw it as a tool, but they didn't see it as sort of the be all end all that would prevent a situation from happening. They did raise concerns about constitutionality of how, and not just in terms of their own kind of sensibility about what's constitutional versus not, but also, especially in California, the possibility of being open to being sued. And that was something that, again, to go back to the anti-elitism, this attitude of, these lawmakers pass these laws, but that implicitly give us, put an obligation on us to do a set of things, but either we don't do those things and then we are taken to task, or we do those things and we're taken to task because the exact things that the law said we could do were actually unconstitutional. And so they were concerned about sort of being in this constitutional bind in terms of enforcing laws. So I think that there was not a strong sense of these things are pointless or unconstitutional or what have you, but there wasn't a sort of universal embrace either. There was a lot of apprehension, and that also that the apprehension also can be seen with regard to domestic violence and the enforcement of gun laws related to domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. Next question, very, very hot topic. What would be, in your opinion, or what are some of the debates around this, the correct way for police to deal with armed protesters and armed counter-protesters?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a huge question. That's a huge question. I think that the fact that there is very little, okay, how do I answer this? What is interesting is not so much that, well, there's a lot of interesting things and a lot of sort of layers to, for example, what we saw with Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he's basically given words of appreciation and then goes on to, kill two people at the protests going on in Wisconsin. I think that what I would call attention to is that this is not just how police deal with armed protesters, but how race creates a double standard in how police deal with armed protesters. So in my research, I could see this double standard at work, for example, in, how police talked very stridently about disarming, the presumed gangbanger or drug dealer, seeing the capacity of people who commit crimes very much associated with sort of urban tropes of criminality, that they've rescinded their right to self-defense and that sort of thing. But then when it came to sort of sovereign citizens or open carriers who tend to be white, although not exclusively, police were much more likely to not treat it as a threat, a dire threat to public safety, but as an annoyance, as a nuisance. Write them a ticket and walk away, try and de-escalate and that sort of thing. And so I think that there is, this goes back to the Bittner quote that in some ways we are asking police to do an impossible task, which is to make fast decisions about, messy situations that can escalate to violence. And I think it's absolutely okay to recognize that. But I think what is also crucial to recognize is that the way in which police make those decisions appears to be absolutely strife with, racial disparities and who is a threat and who is not a threat, who is seen as a, as part of public, as pro-social and productive of public order, as Kyle Rittenhouse presumably was seen by those officers that gave him words of appreciation.
Mm-hmm. So, as I'm sure that you watched last night, you were speaking about this earlier. There's just this nasty debate last night. Obviously, politics are so polarized right now. Trump mentioned that he was not going to condemn any white supremacy groups. Do you think that this type of highly charged political discourse on violence. What does that do to guns in America? Is that part of what's driving up this spike?
You mean in terms of people purchasing guns?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people, so I think it's important to recognize that people who own guns there are many different motivations for owning guns, and even people who are motivated by self-defense think of self-defense in different terms. They think of it in terms of home defense, personal defense, as opposed to, defense of some, white supremacist order, which is, the Proud Boys, who are, Trump did not condemn. He told them instead to stand back and stand by. So I think that people are turning to guns with a general sense that there is a possibility of political violence, of unrest. And I think that, in some ways it's easy to say, this is just a bunch of, this is just what pro-gun America looks like. But from what I've seen from or heard from gun sellers, there are a lot of first-time gun buyers. There are a lot of people who never thought they would buy a gun before in their lives, and they are afraid and they don't know what's going to happen. And I have this quote, and I should pull it up, or I can paraphrase it, from a gun seller, that basically, he says there's so much uncertainty. The uncertainty has been created by fake news. Nobody knows what's going on. And when you have that much uncertainty, you have to have a guarantee. And the only guarantee in this country is the right to keep and bear arms. And so I think that, there's again, this kind of reckoning that I think we need to have with not just sort of saying, oh, this is what people, the pro-gun side does. They buy guns, but that this is actually what this sort of last 6 months is revealing, is that when push comes to shove, the sort of social safety net in the United States comes down to whether or not someone can own a gun, whether or not they own a gun. And I think that is, that's the form of social welfare that we have in this country. And I think really wrapping our heads around that does not just kind of help us understand why gun purchases suddenly surge, but also helps us understand the embeddedness of guns in everyday life as tools of security and safety for people in the US. If you look at the numbers, there's been polls that ask people, do you feel, is a home with a gun safer than a home without a gun? 20 years ago, the majority of people in the US said America is safer with fewer guns. A home without a gun is safer than a home with a gun. Those numbers have completely flipped, and now a majority of people say a home with a gun is safer. More guns make America more safe. Having licensed concealed carry makes America safer. And so that's a really profound kind of statement on what people in this country, the tools at their disposal in order to that they have at their disposal to have a sense of safety and security.
Well, it looks like we are right about at time. So thank you so much to Jennifer Carlson, author of the book Policing the Second Amendment, Guns, Law Enforcement, and the Politics of Race, for joining us today. Copies of Policing the Second Amendment, which is now out, are available everywhere books are sold, so make sure you grab one. We'd also like to thank our audience for watching and participating live. If you would like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth's efforts in making virtual programming, please visit commonwealth.org/online. I am Megan Cassidy, and thank you, and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you so much.